Okay, everyone. Thank you, Ben, for your introduction and everyone else who has helped put this together. I'm going to be talking about what happened in the past, but it's really going to we're also going to be focusing on what is happening now and maybe what will happen in the future. So I think as we talk about things, we'll see what really resonates, and I think a lot will in terms of today's environment. And this first panel is going to be setting the stage actually for a lot of the other discussions that will be coming up over the course of the day. For some of you in the audience who I know from those days, this will be more perhaps of a reminder of what happened. But for many of you, it'll be a little bit of a history lesson as well. So
That we're alive.
yes.
Only a law school.
Yes. So we're going to get to all the panelists. Ruth Messenger is going to have to leave at some point during the panel because of another commitment. So I'll probably start with some questions to her. But before we get to that, maybe it's good for everyone here on the panel to just recall a little bit the general political climate in the city. We're talking about the late 80s, basically, even before Morrissey Board of Estimate triggered all this, and we'll get to Richard talking about that in a moment. So what was that political climate like in the late 80s as the charter revision process got underway? And also, if you could think a little bit or discuss a little bit about how it compares to what you see today in the public. So, Ruth.
Okay, is it okay? Yes, I think it's on. So first of all, I really meant what I said. It's amazing that this panel is here. When I started my notes, even though Marla invited me, I wrote down in my notes for the 25th anniversary that I said, no, this doesn't compute. It's actually 35 years. So what I want to say briefly, Stephen, is that I think about this often, but as appropriate to your question, I thought about it much more in the last year. Even before this horrendous era that we're about to enter into post-election. But even during the debate over charter issues that flared for about 30 seconds, just reminded me of how different it was and how much the people here and some other people had to do with how different it was. At this moment in the history of the world, when there are going to be upheavals in the structure of our government at every level, that we can't begin to imagine. I just want to say that we had this extraordinary model of how people might work together to make change. So I just say briefly what was for me dramatic then, and much more dramatic as time has gone on and it's become harder and harder to do that, was the level of cross-involvement, collaboration, the different number of ranges of perspectives. It seemed like a real thing then, but now it seems like, did it really happen? That we formed a coalition that consisted, and I certainly will leave players out, but consisted of several people in elected office, and you know how suspicious people are of us. So several people in elected office, several really prominent, visible, non-governmental organizations, and the primary city union. You know, and so a shout out to Carol O'Clarkin, who's here, and to Victor Gottbaum. But it was amazing. It was like, and, you know, we just saw Fritz on the screen. Thanks, I think, with significant thanks to Gretchen. But Fritz and the panel were like, oh, here's an interesting coalition of a lot of different people from a lot of different places. Let's entertain what they have to say. And it was not only, from my point of view, that they responded to us as serious players with good ideas, but that there was actual dialogue. There were like moments where they said, wait a minute, could we talk to the two of you? How might we do this or that? And so I also want to add my own personal note, which is, you know, that I was motivated in part by the fact that it was clear, given the politics of the city, we don't have to discuss that at great length, that I was going to be able to move from being a city council member to becoming Manhattan Borough President. At a point at which everything that I understood about borough presidents and the Board of Estimate, which I still think was a great organization, Well, I'm actually going to say everybody's going to laugh, but I'm going to say that for two reasons. One is because it made a forum for city decision making that doesn't exist, and I'm going to say it for another reason that has struck me, even though I lost moving up. We're now in a city in which it's very hard for the average elected official who works her or his tail off in the city council for 12 years to be able to move up, because council members are not visible as individuals. And for me, there was a real benefit in the expanded role that existed of borough president, so that you had a step up from a council member to a borough president to a passable citywide office. I think that's actually become harder since borough presidents lost power. That's a side note. I did love the Board of Estimate. Okay. But I just want to say that for me, it was an amazing personal experience. I knew I was likely to become borough president. So everybody here on this panel will know that I fought very hard for, like, what might we do with borough presidents who were no longer able to be on a Board of Estimate, to look for a different way to give them authority and power without a vote. And I think that we did very well. And that we have borough presidents, and I know some of them are going to be speaking later, who have figured out a way to create, in the best form, a constituency, a kind of fiefdom, and a place where they can influence policy by what they choose to do with them on themselves and with their staffs. And so what I love is that the Citizens Charter Commission proposed new roles and responsibilities, and the administration listened. And on the budget, with a huge shout out to the IBO and what it's become, we were aware then, as we all need to be aware now, Stephen, of how powerful the budget is, and how much at every level of government for time immemorial, the people in charge of budgets have tried to keep them a secret. And, you know, we go and argue about policy, but really, if you want to know what a government or an administration prioritizes or doesn't, you have to understand the budget and where they're making the cuts. And we are now going to be subject to an unbelievable change in budget moving into New York City and New York State from the feds. It's really horrible to anticipate, but we're going to need to understand the value of something like independent budget office, independent budget and analysis and thinking. And I would just say a great memory of my first month in city office, in which I was in 250 Broadway on a really snowy day with one other woman council member, that's relevant, and some program announcer from WNYC called us up and said, well, we wanted to talk about the budget, but it's snowing and we couldn't get anybody else down here, and we assume you don't know anything about it. Because we were new council members and because we were women. And so we went and had a very intelligent discussion, I promise you, of the budget, because we knew then how important it was. And by the time we got, that's like in whenever that was, 12 years later, by the time we got to the charter change and the Citizens for Charter Change, I just think it was really clear and really powerful that we were able to move to have independent analyses of the budget that actually, in my judgment, track, mirror, and improve on what the GAO does at the federal level. And so I want to thank everyone who was here, all of us who are still alive, for having participated in something that is, I'm not going to say it's going to be followed, Stephen, but it is a model for what should be happening now in the city, where we just had a fight about council versus mayor, and in the city as a agent of the federal government that's going to make shifts and changes that are going to hurt New York. Thank you. And you will understand my current passions, at least my other panelists will. I have to leave briefly, so shortly, because I'm on a Georgetown University webinar about what faith-based institutions can do to protect immigrants in this country in this time.
Esmeralda, could you give us your thoughts on political climate of the day and how it compares to today?
First of all, I'm very happy this is happening while we're still above ground. I'm saying that because some of the people that I work with on charter revision, 1989 charter revision, who were valiant, Angela Falcone is one, are no longer with us. So I want you to know that this is tremendous that you have the opportunity to hear from folks that are actually involved. And the first thing I'm going to say is that there was tremendous turmoil going on in the city. And there were upheavals occurring. Not only were the population shifts making change in the city, but there was also correspondingly, at a later pace, as usual, a political shift going on in the city. I was part of the latter. And, I'm a civil rights attorney. I do voting rights and education law and whatever else I can get my hands on. But I want you to understand that it was a very, very different time. Even though Mayor Koch and before Mayor Beam gave lip service, particularly to Black empowerment and voting and Black power in city government, it was almost like a courtesy, and they usually tip their hats to Harlem. Well, when Brooklyn became the source of Black population and basically way outweighed Harlem and the other parts of other areas of the city, including the Bronx, there also came a political shift. I was part of that political shift as a volunteer attorney. I had just come off of being a clerk to federal judge, and I was recruited and joined a group that was led by then State Assemblyman Albert Vann, who's also no longer with us, and joined with my very dear friend now, and then Paul Wooten, who is now, of course, Judge Wooten in the Appellate Division, Second Department, to challenge legally the status quo. And we didn't start with Charter Revision. We didn't start with Morris. We started in 1981 with challenging redistricting and challenging the city who didn't think they had to comply with Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, even though New York City was covered in 3 boroughs. So Paul myself, I want you to know these were, I just told you. Oh, I didn't tell you that. You go to a federal judge usually the year after you come out of law school. I went the second year I was out of law school. Before that, I was at the Corporation Council. And then I was doing this case, volunteer. And I told our clients, who was the Black and Puerto Rican Legislative Caucus of the state, which was then led by Al Vann, that I thought there was a case here. Now, my colleague Paul, who was at that point an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn, and also a volunteer, didn't know anything about voting rights. But I read, and and so did he. So we read and we researched, and I said, I think we have a case. We then were joined by another young buck out of LaBeouf Lamb, and we brought this case challenging New York City Board of Elections that went all the way to the Supreme Court, because the Corporation Council at that time, not this Schwartz, the other Schwartz,
Alan Schwartz.
thank you, Alan Schwartz, who was my former boss, actually did not believe that that an election should be stopped. And you heard what I said, an election should be halted because the city did not comply with the Voting Rights Act and pre-clear changes that were occurring in the city, some of which were 5 polling sites. Well, so long story short, because we have a lot of history to cover here, we won that case after we argued before Thurgood Marshall, and he said, no, the city cannot move forward. I'm halting the election, and the election of 1981 was canceled completely. And thereafter, the city took the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, quite seriously. I think they were very relieved when the Voting Rights Act was struck down. I'm just saying that. Because the election thereafter they went back to using mechanical machines because they thought it would be convenient for a time. So I'm just letting you know that that never would have happened if the Voting Rights Act had still been in place. After we did that case, I'm trying to get my notes here now. After we did that case, Paul and I went on to work with NYCLU, and we did Flateau versus Anderson, which enforced the Voting Rights Act on statewide redistricting, and then NYCLU came up with the idea of Morris, which was a challenge to the Board of Estimate. And nobody ever said what up here said what the Board of Estimate is. That shows you how old we are. We don't think you all know what it was. It was a collection of the 5 borough presidents plus a representative from the mayor that sat and decided on major city contracts and a few other things. But with a city of the budget, with a budget like New York, deciding on contracts is the real deal. Yes, land use, right? One of my favorite things, land use and land use. So you can imagine 5 borough presidents plus mayoral appointee, and they had all this power, but the borough president from Staten Island had the same power as the borough president from Brooklyn. So I'm not going to get into all of it. I'm sure that Richard's going to talk about it some more, but I want you to know it didn't end there. We went on. We then challenged in Andrew versus Koch, using the Voting Rights Act as well as constitutional, the at-large seats that were in the charter. We got them kicked out too. You know, so we're just pulling the charter apart. And the scheme of the charter, the original charter, was thus so that there would be, you know, major mayoral power and a weak city council. So there'll be more talk about what the next scheme is. After the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 was no longer enforced because of the Shelby versus Holder decision that just happened, I don't know, maybe about 8 years, no, more than 8 years ago. Maybe about 8 years ago. New York City is no longer under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act because the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 is not being enforced. However, it's still under Section 2, which declares that there shall not be discrimination against protected classes by any municipality or state government or political subdivision. The fact that there was a boom, 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 boom changes going on in the city was not appreciated by the status quo at all. And some people actually called us like whippersnappers. What are these young whippersnappers going around pulling the city council apart, putting the city charter apart, challenging the power of the borough president? They don't know what they're doing. Well, we did know what we were doing because we actually had, and I'm proud to say that myself, Paul Wooten, and others sat down and wrote out what we wanted the charter to be. And right after we got rid of the Board of Estimate, we worked on those plans for like 3 years. So when the charter revision came around, guess what? Then we created a coalition, new majority coalition for charter change. I probably messed that up, which had African Americans, Caribbean Americans, Latinos, Asians, and we brought those people because at that point, people of color were the majority population, the city of New York, for the first time in a long time, since slavery, I should say. And we wanted to impress the Charter Revision Commission and its wonderful staff that our voices should be heard. And I'm going to end there. I'll probably jump in, as Richard knows how I am.
So, Richard, could you step in?
I would, as I'm listening to Esmeralda, she and Paul and her people were so important in this period. I can't even begin to tell you because the fact, heard in my mind, the whole idea of Morris versus Porter at large seats, which was in essence the same principle. Testament, started in a way that was sort of mathematical and technical. It became very clear quickly how obtuse that was actually. Even though it was the basis for all the victories in the courts. But the real reason behind the Testament case, effort to win it, very much the same as Reynolds v. Sims. It's very important part that were the genesis of this, and that is voting power is the source of equality in this society, certainly in theory and very much in practice, if you can get fair redistricting and other components of voting rights in place that really translate equality, especially for minority groups that are subjugated under all prior voting systems. And if you can enforce those things, power structure. And in some ways, your question about the 80s as compared to now
is a fascinating. Just thank you. Could you hear what I was saying so far?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought over. All right. I talk. Yeah, right.
What made it red?
Right. I talk pretty loud anyway. So anyway, the point is that in looking at the 80s power structure and the power structure that ended up being undermined, as Ruth actually started to allude to in some ways, from the point of view of politicians. That is, politicians' point of view was it was being eroded. But the power structure was changing dramatically as a result of all the things that Esmeralda and Paul and others were doing, but also was the focus of the Board of Estimate case. And here's what I mean by that. The technical reality of Brooklyn being 6 times as large as Staten Island and having the same participation on the Board of Estimate is the vehicle by which the Board of Estimate ultimately was eliminated because of Gretchen and Fritz and Eric and the Charter Revision Commission, which was the only logical thing to do in the wake of the case. And of course, I think the best policy in the wake of the case. But prior to the time of its elimination, think back on the history. Virtually every county Democratic leader that controlled the borough president or was the borough president had gone to prison.
Well,
Or
not Manhattan,
what?
not Manhattan, not Manhattan.
Or died or self-inflicted wound. If you go back and look at them, the county Democratic leaders were the font of corruption in this city back into the 30s. They were the method by which all the money, all the property, all the wealth of the city was distributed because the Board of Estimate controlled all the wealth of the city. And the Board of Estimate, it may have been a forum for certain people to get together and voice their views, but there were usually 8 children sitting up on the podium who had nothing to do except with the actual people they represented, because the actual representatives rarely attended. Sometimes they attended. And you had the mayor, the city council president, and the controller behind the scenes controlling 6 votes. But of course, you have to remember that the mayor very rarely voted with the controller and the city council president, because the city council president and the controller are always running for mayor. So they split all the time. And therefore, the borough presidents had all the power. And if they cooperated, they had all the power. And they had something called borough deference, which meant that anything in a particular borough, everybody deferred to that particular borough president. And so you had this tiny little group of people who traded favors, and the favors were hundreds of millions of dollars of New York City property, opportunities, contracts, budget, and the like. The budget was done,
Contract.
right. The budget was done.
We all agree, even though I loved it, I agree with her.
Yeah. Well, I would have loved it too if I was a borough president. So the 80s and the period before was what New York City was all about, and everybody in the world, including people in New York City, viewed government as corrupt. Let's be clear. The corruption today is personal corruption. It's a strange sort of opportunistic personal corruption, which does occur. There's no question. There's very little institutional corruption where big money is delivered to favored campaign donors and supporters in the boroughs. So I just want you to think about that as the tableau in which Morris versus Board of Estimate came to fruition, and the work that Esmeralda and Paul did with respect to trying to get minority empowerment through voting rights came to fruition in the late 80s and early 90s, and was institutionalized by Fritz, Eric, Gretchen, and the Charter Revision Commission, and we became a far more transparent, because nothing in the Board of Estimate was transparent. I mean, everything was secret. Everything was done behind closed doors. The only way that anybody learned anything even about the budget was because the city council had parallel power over the city budget. But in the Board of Estimate, nothing, and the Board of Estimate essentially controlled, because they controlled the revenue stream. And the budget was, of course, mostly about the spending. And so the Board of Estimate controlled the budget as far as we could tell and as far as we analyzed. And when we had the charter revision, that was all eliminated. You had a city council, which was essentially a transparent organization. Too many people not to be transparent. It's a practical matter. Even if they wanted to keep it secret, they couldn't. And they love to talk, and they love to talk to the press. So you had a more traditional framework of government. You had what became a strong mayor. I want to say one more thing about the mayor. The mayor was a cipher for the Board of Estimate. Koch, for all of Koch's bluster, for all of his TV appearances, for all of his "how am I doing," he had no power at all. He was beholden to the borough presidents for power.
County lead.
The county leader. Well, the borough presidents were the county leaders, or just the handmaid county leaders. And so the county leaders controlled, which meant also something, one more point about this that I think is essential about the nature of New York City before the charter revision versus the nature now. The boroughs actually had enormous power, which resulted in what many people thought was a good thing, that Manhattan didn't dominate, but that there was really a spread of concentration of certainly wealth, but also focus on the boroughs more so than after the charter revision. I think after the charter revision, there is definitely strong borough representation from the council and the power in the council, and of course just the votes that the mayor has to get elected. But it was much more of a city of a whole. It became a cultural, economic center that was a whole city, whereas borough identity prior to the charter revision was much more powerful, and it was a cultural and perceptive change of how we thought about the city, in my view. I mean, other people may disagree with this, but I view the city as much more consolidated after the charter revision than it was before, totally as a function of the fact that the democratic machines were essentially rendered powerless by the charter revision and the Board of Estimate case leading to the charter revision. And I think I should leave it with that.
Okay, thank you. Gretchen? Again,
Well-
talking about the climate of the day, the late 80s.
No, I'm not going to talk about the
Okay.
climate.
That's fine. We've heard enough. We've heard enough.
No, I'm still alive, but I've lost my memory. So I'm learning things here because I don't remember what happened. But I want to shift this slightly and remind people that New York City is a big city and not all of us are lawyers or even follow politics. And I think one of the reasons I was hired is I didn't even know there was a charter when I was hired. And I certainly couldn't have answered the question, what was the tone of the city in 1986 when I was hired? So IBO, don't forget the people. Don't just talk to the people who are insiders who already know a lot. Remember that everybody has to have a voice and everybody is important if the communications are well shaped and well targeted to different interest groups working on different parts of what you're interested in. And that's where I'm going to stop.
Okay, thank you. Ruth, you have a few more minutes, right? I wanted to shift focus a little bit, especially while you're still here. So you mentioned before the Citizens Charter change and organizing. You still do a lot of organizational work. How has that changed? What's the same, what's different then and now?
I want to say that when I talked about difference, it's because I was really despairing in this last 6 months when there was so much going on, as Richard said politely, a different form of corruption, but some serious questions about changing the structure of city government, which in this instance, in the last 6 months with the so-called charter vote, was just appallingly handled with no respect for what we did. So that's what's different. But what's the same, Stephen, is that what Gretchen said, where people really get together and do it across some lines of difference and recognize the wildly changing and diversity of the city and the fact that we are a majority minority city, and have a future based on our diversity. The same things that worked for the Citizens for Charter change have to happen, and it's not like they're not happening. It's like it's a difficult time, and everybody here knows. I'm amazed that so many people here could get out of bed after last week. But we're going to be in for endless efforts here. And so, take the issue that I'm going to talk about. We're a country, I'm just going to do this for a minute, based on immigrants. Everyone in this room is an immigrant unless you are Native American or you're a descendant of immigrants. And the city keeps ignoring that history to its peril. And there's going to need to be a huge outpouring of the same kind of coalition building. So we're going to need the amazing lawyers, even the lawyers who break things up. Thank you, Richard. And the lawyers who look to what Esmeralda was talking about. And it's great that she gave the history because it was lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. That's part of it. But what's the same or can be the same is we need this kind of coalition. And I'm just pointing at the panel, but that's not really what I mean. We need the unions that are involved. Okay. We need the citizen groups that are involved. I will tell you right now in this city, despite what you read or don't read in the terrible media coverage that we have in New York City, terrible. There are endless numbers of organizations, both community-based and faith-based, that are providing services to our newest New Yorkers at an astounding level. And they are endlessly frustrated by this city government. And so now they are putting a lot of their energy in, like, how do we work together? How do we challenge the city on a 36-day eviction? I just want you to think about how much money the city spends evicting thousands of people every 60 days and relocating them. That's where IBO, that's where a whole piece of our tax dollars are going. It's the stupidest thing I've ever seen. It's a waste of money. It's a abuse of people, and it's immoral. But it will be the same kinds of coalitions. I might be getting too old to get out of bed and do them, but it's going to be exact. So when you ask what's the same, it's like government has power. We need to be, as a citizenry, very watchful of that power, looking for changes and shifts that open up access to citizens and that engage more people. And my hope is, as terrible as the era in which we're in, the people will see that much more need to get involved, to speak up at every level. But I just want to say the New York City response, thank you, all of you who do something about it, to 500,000 new New Yorkers at a human being level is just astounding. And people get no attention and no coverage for what they're doing. And now those people are now organizing, and it's been going on for a year, to build the same kind of coalitions to challenge the city on its policy. And now we're going to have to challenge the federal government as well. But that's what's the same. The same is that's what works. And what was exciting about Citizens for Charter Change when we did it, and Gretchen may not have known we had a charter, but I would say that I wasn't quite sure until it happened that we could have a few pals who were at the lower levels of having any power, sit with Victor Ratbaum, sit with amazing community-based organizations, sit with lawyers who were making actual change and say, we need to do this together. And then what was astounding and what doesn't happen very often, and I said it before, but I'm going to say it again, is Gretchen and Fritz and Eric really listened and really came to us at time and point and said, well, like, what might you suggest? That happens so rarely that's something that we should all strive to see again in our lifetimes.
I can just a very quick follow-up. If you think about the technology that's available today, the technology that has led to X, formerly known as Twitter, but is that technology something that's useful potentially for organizing, or does it create an impediment?
You're talking to somebody who has to get her grandchildren, get her into communication with the world. But yeah, I mean, I find the system somewhat overwhelming, but I think this last election seriously showed us that unless we understand the ways in which people get information and can get information and that can influence critical decisions, then we're going to be lost. So we need everybody, including people my age, but everybody to sort of think about where is information coming in and how do we use that as an organizing tool. And from that point of view, of course, it's spectacular in theory. You can reach lots more people, a lot more quickly than you could in the era that we were talking about. Thank you, guys. I'm going to see if I can get some immigrants.
Thank you. Richard, if I could come back, actually for all of you, but starting with Richard, I was reminded, I'd almost forgotten that there was the Ravage Commission, of course, before the Schwartz Commission, and that was created because of the Morris litigation.
During the course of it, yeah.
During the, and they were considering changes to the Board of Estimate because of the litigation. But then when the Supreme Court somewhat unexpectedly decided to hear the case, there was like a pause. It's like, well, why are we rushing in to change the Board of Estimate if the Supreme Court might reverse? I mean, why were they considering it if not because that might be an option? Let's say the Supreme Court had reversed. I don't know what theory, but let's assume they had. Then where would you have been? I mean, where all this discussion of all the changes that could occur because of this case, suddenly the impetus for it would have gone away. Like, what's their plan B?
No plan B. This was it's interesting you say that because I think Ruth would be borough president, and she'd have all the power. Maybe she'd be mayor by now, but in any event, the point is that there was so much institutional power in the Board of Estimate. The resistance politically and legally was enormous. I mean, I remember Andrew Stein was apoplectic and all the borough presidents, Claire Schulman, it was Claire Schulman, and Nick Garifas, who's now a federal judge, was her counsel, and they were fighting this tooth and nail, and it was they were very well represented. The Corporation Council did a very good job, and the case was fought. They won the case the first level in the Eastern District. They won the case on the basis, and this is kind of interesting, that the 6 votes controlled by the citywide people dominated, and that in principle, the borough presidents were on the Board of Estimate, and everybody was on the Board of Estimate, not because they were elected to the Board of Estimate, but because as part of their election to a separate office, they were placed on the Board of Estimate. And there was some precedent for that about special purpose bodies not being subject to one person, one vote in the Supreme Court. And that precedent convinced Judge Neer, the first judge who looked at this case, that he didn't have to impose one person, one vote on the Board of Estimate. It went to the Second Circuit, and the Second Circuit said, no. This is they are really elected to the Board of Estimate because that's where all the power is. Their power doesn't really exist, especially on the budget issues and like. It is a traditional governmental body. And therefore, it's subject to one person, one vote. And then it went back to Judge Neer, and he made calculations. There were lots of mathematical analysis. It was done with experts, Steve Brams in particular, who looked at this in many, many different ways because this was sui generis. It was a combination of citywide and individual districts. And there was some precedent for that in other contexts and at large representation, but nothing like this, where the citywide dominated the voting power in theory, even though they didn't because they always split. And so you had a situation where it was unique. It was not something that the courts had really looked at previously. We won, and we won in the Second Circuit. And the Second Circuit said the budget power is plainly the criteria by which you have to judge whether a body is subject to one person, one vote. And this clearly has more power over the budget than anything else, notwithstanding all of its other powers. And that's traditional legislative function. And therefore, it has to be subject to one person, one vote. And so we thought we were home free. We thought that the Supreme Court would absolutely turn it down. But the fight went on. Zimroth was excellent. Peter was excellent. There were, he was had all these theories. Everybody was coming up with theories. There were many interveners. Staten Island was going to secede. You remember? Staten Island was going to secede because they wouldn't get their inordinate power. And so, but we thought we'd won. I remember where I was when I heard that the Supreme Court had granted cert. And I practically fell down. I mean, literally, it was like, oh my God, they don't grant cert to affirm, they grant cert to reverse. And so, and we also had this belief that David Dinkins, who was originally he was a borough president. He was actually in favor of the elimination of the Board of Estimate when he was very active at the NYCLU. But then he became a borough president, and his perspective quickly changed. And he was close to Justice Marshall. And we had this paranoid feeling that he was influencing the grant. And so it was granted. And at that point, it was like, what's happening now? And as you say, Ravitch stood down at some level. Now, what it would have been like. So, he wanted to run for mayor, exactly. Right. But he also stood down because there was no point if they were going to reverse. But that moment in time was the critical moment, right? Because we won 9-0, as it turned out. But the fact that they took it caused everybody to, at least at the political level, to breathe a sigh of relief. Because they said, oh, okay, we'll hold on to this. And what would the city be like now if that were the result? I've got to say that I think that we would have more secrets than we've ever thought existed. And that we would be a very different city with much less sense of the capacity to get things done unless you had a lot of money and a lot of political juice. I don't think organizations like the ones that Ruth has been describing to deal with migrant work or other work that has been so successful in New York City over the last year, notwithstanding the city's opposition, could have any voice whatsoever. Anyway, I mean, that's a dystopian view because I'm very biased in favor of the changes that were made.
Thank you. For both, I guess, Esmeralda and Gretchen, thinking about or sort of following up on what Bruce was talking about a few minutes ago about organizing, about communicating. If you could both speak to the efforts made then in terms of coalition building, in terms of outreach, and how things may be different now. And just as a personal reminiscence, thinking about when the city council elections were canceled briefly for a period of time, and I was a rather junior person at the corporation counsel's office at the time, and talk about what now seems incredibly primitive when the new lines were drawn, had to be submitted to the Justice Department for pre-clearance, whereas now, yeah, hit a button, boom. At that time, I was given these gigantic maps, put on a plane to fly down to Washington, drop off the maps, and fly right back to New York. That's how submissions like that were made. So you think about that, it seems like ancient history, but it was a totally different world in terms of communication, right, Gretchen?
I'm just going to add something. I saw Tim Tompkins last night. Tim was Eric Lane's chief of staff and was responsible for the submission to the Department of Justice. We had to rent a van, and it was the largest submission ever made to the Department of Justice. I think Tim put together 50,000 pages. So it was hardly pushing a button in a PDF. So
Right.
I want to say that I want to emphasize something, that the Charter Revision Commission of '89 actually ushered in the first breath of open government in New York City in history. It was amazing. I was still a junior attorney, but by '89, I wasn't as junior as I had been in '80. So, I had done a lot of advocacy in government, had a lot of doors slammed in my face, had a lot of doors never even opened. And for people to ask us to come in with our suggestions, and of course we couldn't email it then. We brought it in and they said, "Are you serious?" And they said, "We've been thinking about this for quite a while. And we think we should do X, Y, Z. All of this should be in the charter." And there were hearing upon hearings upon hearings upon hearings. There were so many hearings that Peter Williams, who was running our charter, the Center for Law and Social Justice that I ran, who was running our project, actually got a little sheepish coming into me and say, "There's another hearing. They want you to testify." I said, "Another hearing?
I got
I mean-
tired of this voice. Figured it out.
Another hearing? What are we going to say differently? We've already talked to them 50 times, and that doesn't count the individual meetings that they would ask for to explain how we should do. What do you think the ideal city council should be?" And I remember I said, large and small. Large power, a greater number than 35, and as small as we could make them as single member districts. And I also suggested something that was radical at the time and didn't happen, which I said, and we could also maybe allow people to do something that's almost like what we have now for I'm not gonna remember the name of the way we vote now. Almost like ranked choice. I recommended that, and I remember Fritz said, I said, "No, it's being done in other parts of the country and the world." And I said, "No. All right." So then the fallback is small single member districts. Yeah. And I even got a law professor from Harvard to talk to them about how, ranked choice voting could work. And then I was like, "Oh, no, this is too much." The fallback was great. Particularly since we had a large say in how the Voting Rights Commission was going to work. And because we put in something in the Voting Rights Commission, I'm saying this is real. We put in language that they thought was a good idea, that the composition of the Voting Rights Commission, no, that's not Voting Rights, the Districting Commission, should be proportional to population. Richard Ravish then brought a lawsuit 2 years later to get that eliminated. Oh yeah, very nasty. This whole idea that people who are not in power should have power because they live in a city and was offensive, and he actually called it a quota. So I don't have to go far. We all know what has happened to affirmative action and DA with the Supreme Court. So he was absolutely against any kind of proportional representation even in an appointed body that was looking at hopefully proportional representation for the city. So there were some great things that happened. We put in an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that's still there. I don't know how it's really functioning because it hasn't been funded. All I can say is that the minutest thing we could think of putting in, they actually listened. They didn't do them all, but they listened. That is the first and last time that's ever happened in my career.
Gretchen?
The first day I was on the job, we had little funky offices on Chambers Street. And my head was spinning. I didn't know what the job was. And a guy walked in with a backpack. Nice looking guy. And he said, "Is Gretchen Dykstra here?" And I said, "That's me." And he said, "Hi, I'm Gene Rushinoff." And I shrugged, and he said, "I'm the general counsel for NYPIRG, and I just want you to know we're very interested in charter revision. We are very interested in good government, and I wish you the best of luck. You're going to see a lot of me, but I have one word of advice for you." And he said, "Remember, if they trust the process, they'll trust the outcome." He shook my hand, he walked away, and Gene Rushinoff, as was Esmeralda, as were many people, as was Marla, incredibly helpful on both substance and process. So if you'd allow me, I'll talk a little bit about the internal process. And I really thank the people who are saying that it was, what's the word? Terrific. I didn't say it, Esmeralda said it. One of the goals of charter revision was to build opportunities to make sure that the people could participate. So if that was one of the goals of the Charter Commission, it better be one of the goals of the staff. And we took that very seriously. And one of the things that Eric and Fritz did was that they combined communications and community outreach, which I think was really important. And on the community outreach side, we divided the city into 4 boroughs, not 5, because Staten Island was rolled into Brooklyn for that purpose. We hired 4 people on the community outreach team, all of which had good communication skills. They had a little bit of experience in their backgrounds on one of the 4 topics: budget, contracting, land use, or governance, with a little bit of experience in that. And we assigned them a borough, and we assigned them outreach to all of the community groups, the coalitions, and the civic organizations in their boroughs. So their job was initially to tell people, to let people know about what the Charter Commission was up to, what our mandate was, to begin to build relationships. And that turned out to be important because each of those people were assigned to the legal and the research division. So there was, under Frank Morrow, there were lawyers and researchers who were working on those 4 topics. And at their meetings was always somebody from the outreach team reporting back to what they had heard in the field. And I like to think that that made a big difference. And meanwhile, the communications staff, headed up by Bruce Corey, who was a wonderful writer, and Linda Lang, who was sort of the operations people, we put together a mailing list. And yes, time is different. We didn't have email and all the rest of it, but we first had to put together a really good mailing list. We had to identify our audiences. And there were many of them, but we thought in wholesale. We put together a mailing list of some 45,000 names. And Bruce Corey then came up with a calendar of newsletters that would go to all 45,000 people. And by the way, that ended up being very helpful when there were folks that argued at the very end that we hadn't done enough outreach, and we could pull out our mailing list and say, well, that's funny, Margaret, you've been on the mailing list since the beginning, getting all of our newsletters. So the first thing I would say to the IBO staff is identify the audiences as granular as you can get, and then figure out which of those audiences are going to be most interested in what part of the budget is impacting them. We didn't assume that everybody in Queens who was interested in land use would necessarily be interested in contracting or governance. They might have opinions, but they weren't as expert or they weren't as well informed. And so it was targeting audiences at both the field level as well as the communications written level. Once we had the staff in place and we had a strategy in place, yes, we did have lots of meetings. In fact, I think at the last count, there were 250 public hearings and public meetings. An interesting point is our offices were open 24/7. And every time there was a public hearing, Linda Lang would, in fact, we hire people who work late at night at law offices to produce those transcripts. So at the next meeting, everybody had the transcripts available. So it was the transparency issue that was so important, which is you got to let people see what happened at the last hearing. Some of those hearings went on till 2:00 in the morning. And I have to give a big shout out to the commissioners. I can't remember any commissioner who didn't go to the overwhelming majority of those 250 meetings. It was extraordinary. Now, Nat Leventhal, who I happen to know pretty well, balked when we asked him to go to community meetings, and not all of the commissioners wanted to do that kind of work. But the amount of time they put in was extraordinary, both in individual meetings and in public. So we had the public hearings, but I go back to the idea that you can't assume that people have to understand government or politics to be concerned and interested in the work you're doing. If you frame it well to their interests and you go to them, you don't wait for them to come to you. Gene Rushinoff was the exception, coming to me. But the fact is, we knew we had to go into the boroughs and into the communities and into every coalition and give them the help they needed on the substance that the commission was talking about to get their responses to what we were talking about. Why did that matter? And by the way, the communications was, we are proud of the fact that we did lots of different kinds of communication. The written word was not the only word. We produced a 2-part series on the local PBS series. We developed a map. If you've never seen it, there's a framed one with Pauline Toole. We designed a fabulous looking map on what the new city government would look like. We produced a game book for parents because we were talking to PTA meetings. We went to PTA meetings because we knew the parents would vote. What were they interested in? We hired a games maker to come up with a 20-page simple series of games you could play over dinner. My favorite is what Gene Rushinoff did for us right before the vote. We couldn't, and by the way, this is important, you're not allowed to spend city money telling people how to vote. So we could never say vote yes on the charter proposals. We had to get them other people telling them to vote yes. So what did NYPIRG do? They dressed up in the Halloween parade. They carried signs saying vote yes. And the Halloween parade in 1989 was like no Halloween parade we've seen since. And there was NYPIRG. We went to every street fair. We handed out those game books. We got names. We did our work. And I'll end by just saying that New Yorkers are not used to voting on referenda. And we knew that. So we only had 2 questions. We isolated the question on landmarking because we knew that could scuttle the whole thing. And everything else was put into one question, simply written. easy to understand. We designed a book that we paid to put it in the New York Times and the Daily News the Sunday before Election Day. And we were pulled into court to try and stop it because the delay movement had gathered up steam. And the delay movement kept saying, we hadn't done enough outreach. You should delay the vote. You should delay the vote. We went into court. We won. And every New Yorker who got a Sunday paper, the Daily News or the New York Times, saw a very simple explanation of the charter proposals. We won that vote by 33. We won it overwhelmingly, but I took special pride in the fact that we had 33% more people vote on that charter revision than had ever voted on any referendum in New York. And I am convinced it was because we were in the field. We didn't expect people to come to us. That's my.
Thank you.
This is very important. I think this is what you're referring to, Esmeralda. I will say that Ed Koch never called anybody at the Charter Commission to tell them how to vote or how to think. It was quite remarkable. Eric and Fritz, I think, would both agree to that Ed Koch did not, in fact, muddy the waters, but he did give us an unlimited budget. And that is not immaterial. Nobody ever asked me, how much is this going to cost? How much is it going to cost to produce and distribute 250,000 game books? That was important, but that might be made up now with social media because, in fact, social media is cheap. The trick there is to figure out the influencers and who's reaching which groups. But that you'll only find out by going to the field and asking the people. How do you get your information? Don't sit in your office and think you know, and make sure the information is accurate. That's the other thing. Make sure that you are, in fact, accurate and full in the information. Is that what you meant, Esmeralda? Yeah.
Thank you. We have about 10 or 15 minutes or so for questions. If anyone would like to ask, come to the microphone. I just wanted to, I was reminded about that when you mentioned the map, which was like buildings, right? It looks like, here's the building, that's the city council, here's the building. That map has been in the law department's legal counsel division conference room ever since. And actually, right in this building at the Center for New York City State Law, it's hanging up in our conference room.
Very
So
nice. And it's hanging in my kitchen.
Yes, that map has been all over. Anyway, here, let's have some questions.
Hi there. My name is Tom Main, and I'm a professor at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at Peru College. My name is Tom Main. I'm a professor at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at Peru College. I've been writing about New York City government for more than 40 years. I got a book coming out in the spring about welfare policy in New York City. So what am I going to do now? I'm going to write another book about New York City government, specifically the book, I hope, on the New York City, on the charter change, 89 charter change. So let me ask this question to you and to everybody here. The hypothesis I'm going to test in the book, okay, was stated by a member of the symposium that New York Law School held on the 25th anniversary of charter change. So this is a symposium 10 years ago. And one of the people who introduced the speakers at the symposium said, well, I think that, and these are his words, and this is the.
So just to make sure you get to the question.
Okay. So the point is this: the theory, the hypothesis is the resurgence of New York City since '89 is largely caused by charter revision of 1989. What do you think about that hypothesis?
Answer is yes.
Let's hear. Let's
Answer
hear
is
why.
yes.
Okay. Why?
Because I think I alluded to it a little bit when I was talking about the world before and the world after. And that is because of the consolidation, at least in the consciousness, New Yorkers, of the city. The city is not a bunch of boroughs anymore. It is obviously their borough identities, but they are subsidiary to the identity of the city as a whole. And that collective consciousness, I think, that collective sense of togetherness of the city is a a real font of the a genesis, if you will, of the excitement, the world position, the sense of power, the sense of importance of New York City. And I think that was certainly important before, but it wasn't in the same realm as it is now. This is, I think, by most accounts, by most people, maybe I'm completely blinkered in this regard, the greatest city and, you know, the greatest place in the world. Hopefully it will remain so for a while. We may not know that, but it is unique among cities in the world. And I think that's consolidated by virtue of the way that the charter affected all the institutions of the city. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I pick up on that for just say that one of the cities that in fact called us during the charter revision process was Los Angeles. And they were talking about that very issue, how Los Angeles is splintered. It doesn't have a unified view of itself. And how did we achieve it? But Richard would know better than me about the resurgence.
Why was the 1981 Voting Rights Act omitted?
What?
Why was the 1981 Voting Rights Act omitted?
In the case, you're in the
The
Mentioned it was
1965 Voting Rights Act? Which act?
1981. You mentioned the 1981.
No, there was the case in 1981. The case was using the 1965 Voting Rights Act to enforce it on New York City. So why was it the question?
omitted.
Oh, why was it included?
Now, why were we?
New York covered?
In other words, you said before that we weren't covered and that you got us.
No, I didn't. No.
No,
We were covered from the beginning. Yeah.
It was New York.
Oh, why was New York? All right.
I would speak Clarence and Michigan.
Okay. All right. New York City is the most segregated city up north. And some people say in the whole country. But that's not why it was covered by the Voting Rights Act, Section 5. They had a two-pronged test to see whether a jurisdiction should be covered. And it had to do, all the way back in 1965, it had to do with the history of voter registration among people of color, particularly Blacks and Latinos, they call it Hispanics, and participation, and I'm sorry, and the level of registration and the level of actual voting. New York failed the test of how many Blacks were registered as opposed to the population and how many Latinos were registered. And the person that actually brought this to the attention of the Justice Department, who was making a decision and applying the formula, the Section 4 formula for Voting Rights Act, was Herman Badillo, an outstanding Puerto Rican lawyer who did a lot of work in New York City and New York State. He brought this to the attention of the Justice Department, and the Justice Department included Brooklyn, Kings County, they go by counties, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Manhattan. And because those are the three boroughs that he asked to be looked at. Of course, Queens has been screaming for 20 years about why they weren't included. Staten Island never wanted to be included. That's why it happened. And once it was covered, New York ignored it until that lawsuit.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ralph Yazzo. From North Brooklyn, and I have some questions. I thank you all. And also, you talk about the budget and transparency, but from, I think Gretchen said, non-lawyer perspective, we the people, at least out in Brooklyn, and don't understand the budget at all. So is there any, the questions are, is there any apps or things in the details, right? Because the only time I ever hear about the budget is from CBS or NBC saying there've been cuts, slashed, but we want to see the details. So short questions are, is there an app or something that shows the details? Is there an app that shows the property tax proposal changes, how it affects individual property? Is there an app and there is right now, voter transparency. Did you know that you can see down to the block level how people have voted? and you can see the voting history of every person, right? That votes. You can actually see, and so you can practically, if there's not many votes, you can tell what their vote is, right? So those are some of my questions. And social media, I agree that we should use social media. So I'm a computer programmer. So anyone who wants to talk about social media and using it effectively, let me know. All right.
Gretchen?
Let me just say
Questions?
that
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
just because you get a kick out of this, I've recently moved to Haverford, Pennsylvania, and I was going into Philadelphia. I took the train, and the first thing I saw when I came out of the train station in Philadelphia was a mural, maybe this big, right in front of a public park that described the budget of Philadelphia. The first top was mandatory. How big is the budget? What's mandated to what? And then under it, what is discretionary and what can it fund? And then the other half of the mural was Philadelphians with bubbles over their heads saying what their priorities were. It's brilliant.
We don't do
I just
that.
told Laura Chappie about that.
Yeah, but we don't do that here. And I want it down
Right,
to the
just wanna-
budget line.
sorry, we-
Yeah, sorry.
Limited time, to have some others. Thank you.
Question, were there any ideas or recommendations that you came up with that you came across during the 89 charter revision that didn't make it in that you think would still be worthwhile to consider today or came in later?
Let me just say that I think there was one idea that was adopted that wasn't very good.
Not exactly the question, but let's hear it.
No, I'll reverse it. Just because I think this problem that we see in the last 6 months of the city council being neutered by the mayor, being able to put a referendum on and trump, to use a good word,
Okay.
the city council referenda is a device that was created for all the for good reasons, but was what? It was required by state law. Really?
So it wasn't
But
our mistake.
I thought it's in the charter also, though.
No, it's,
Oh, you're right. It's the municipal law.
and Senator Kruger has introduced a bill, maybe others as well, to eliminate or change that.
Yeah, thank you, Marla, because it's just ripe, it's ripe for abuse.
Thank you.
Right.
Anyway, but anyway, but
Okay, but the charter is
back to the
perfect. The
original.
charter is
anything else that's missing?
I was gonna, and I don't know the answer to this, but during the Ravitch Commission, we did put on the ballot something about infrastructure and a review of the capital budget every 5 or 10 years. I don't know if that's ever been implemented. I have a feeling it hasn't been. Okay, so that's the only thing I remember.
Esmeralda,
That's not bad.
anything missing?
Well, obviously, we wanted the Board of Education, to be a lot more under the control of the council rather than the mayor. And if you followed what has happened, they don't even call it its proper legal name, the Board of Education. Under Mayor Bloomberg, he changed the name, he's all about the name, to the Department of Education. But more importantly, he got the state legislature to give mayoral control over the budget and the rule and the processing of the Board of Education, which another court said was not really legal. But let's put it like that. That needs to be corrected, as well as this whole abusive use of charter revision. And I also believe we need to put in something in there where the city council cannot change the charter without a referendum.
So a lot of state law issues there, and which is why it's now the Center for New York City and State Law.
Exactly right.
One more question. and then-
Hello, my name is Ben Weinberg. I'm the policy director at Citizens Union, and I'm so glad you just brought up that legislation because I was going to plug the bill by Senator Kruger and Tony Simone, assembly member, that would remove the mayor's ability to kick other commissions and questions off the ballot. It would also establish minimum timeframes for charter revisions, and we are looking for memos of support. So a room full of people who are interested in charter revisions. But my question was related to it, and it's about what Gretchen has mentioned, and that was about what you describe as the deference that Mayor Koch gave the commission, and that just surprised me because we've seen charter commissions since then, and they are often controlled by a mayor, and it seems like they are doing what the mayor is interested. So how do you explain that special situation?
I can't get inside Ed Koch's head, but my guess is that it had a lot to do with Fritz Schwartz. And Fritz and Ed Koch were close. Fritz had worked for him. And I think that Ed Koch had great respect for Fritz. And I think he had great respect for Nat Leventhal, who was the vice chair, who had also worked for Koch as his deputy mayor for operations. And then hiring Eric Lane, who knew a lot about state law, rounded out, because I think it's fair to say that Fritz and Eric made a really good team. And so that's my guess.
I have one further observation, which might or might not be true, and I've never heard Ed Koch express anything to this effect, but I can imagine he was very frustrated as mayor by the fact that he was given all the ostensible responsibility and none of the authority. And that's what the charter revision changed. The mayor now has both authority and responsibility, maybe too much, but
And yet that was not an easy point to get to. There was disagreement on the charter commission about that.
The
very
strong mayor,
question.
that's right. the
And
strong
he
mayor.
still didn't, in fact, get involved. So I give him a lot of credit.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to thank our panel. Thank you, Steve. And thank you all. And as a reminder, the next panel will start in about 10 minutes at 11 o'clock on the New York City budget and the creation of IBO. Thank you.